Everyone. So welcome to University College Cork, and we're at APC Microbiome Ireland. My name is Paul Ross. I'm Director of the Centre, and we're privileged today to have Felice Jacka with us, a distinguished professor from down under, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Author of 2 books, Zoo in Your Poo and Brain Changer, and also a very distinguished, highly cited researcher. So thanks, Felice, for coming today.
Thanks, Paul. It's a pleasure.
And John Cryan, who is a senior professor at the university, but who coined the phrase psychobiotics. One of the main things we're going to talk about today is brain-gut axis. So, John?
Delighted to be here, Paul.
Okay. And so this forms part of World Microbiome Day. World Microbiome Day is on Friday. We set it up, if people remember, back in Killarney in 2018. And we have a number of events at APC Microbiome Ireland over this week. And we're celebrating the importance of our microbiome to our health and to the planet and so on. And so today is called Microbiome 101. We want to discuss really, I suppose, fundamental aspects of the microbiome and how it affects our health. And in particular, this is focused on the brain-gut axis. And I suppose to start us off, we might just ask John, would you say something about the brain-gut axis and say something about that important communication between our brain and our gut?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so the brain-gut axis, or even gut-brain axis, is that bi-directional communication that we have between what's going on in our gut and what's going on in our brain. And we've known that this exists for centuries, but in the last 2 decades, with the real advances in microbiome science, a new player has entered the fray, and that is the trillions of bacteria that we have within our gut. And we now realize that these bacteria can talk to our gut to talk to our brain, and that we actually have a microbiota gut-brain axis. And what our team here, and we have a very multidisciplinary team of almost 60 people working on the microbiome gut-brain axis at APC Microbiome Ireland, we're trying to really figure out the mechanisms of communication between the gut and the brain, and then can we translate any of the findings that we have in animal models to the human condition. And so this has been a really exciting journey, and some of the key discoveries made here in Cork have really informed the field, and that when we talk about our gut feelings or our gut instincts, we actually now know there's a real biology behind this, Paul.
Wow. And have you actually isolated organisms that can make a difference? Indeed,
and that's part of our plan, is to try and understand what are the strains of bacteria that can actually positively affect this signaling pathway from the gut to the brain and affect brain and behavior. And we start trying to do that in a science-informed way, trying to identify strains of bacteria that have certain properties that we know could be positive for overall health, including mental health. And that has led us to coining, as you said, the term psychobiotic, a phrase that my colleague Ted Dinan and myself coined many years ago now, where we really realized that we can target our gut, and in particular our gut microbiome, for positive mental health benefit.
And I suppose it's just not microbes, but it's food and diet.
Exactly, and I think that's a really important part, and we might come back to that in a little while. But what we're now realizing is that whole diet approaches and targeted feeding our microbes, because we have to remember that the microbiome is like a factory. It produces all kinds of weird and wonderful chemicals that our bodies wouldn't be able to produce without it. And factories depend on many things, but 2 things that they really rely on is the quality of the workers and the raw materials. And here the workers are those bacterial strains we talked about, but the raw materials come from the diet. And that's really an important part. And we're beginning to understand that we really have a diet microbiome gut-brain axis.
You know, it's something that fascinated me, that Ted used to say, was that a lot of the psychobiotic drugs that initially were antibiotics, and I suppose antibiotics definitely affect the microbiota, but in a lot of cases in a negative way.
Yeah.
And do you find that?
Well, it's interesting because about a quarter, studies have shown about a quarter of all known medications that we take, that we go to the pharmacy to take, will affect the composition of our microbiome. We don't know they're all bad, but for some of them definitely. And the question is, and so we're working on this in the context of pesticides in the environment. We've been working on antidepressants, antipsychotic medications, as well as drugs used for cancer chemotherapy, because chemobrain, the effects of drugs on the brain is a really important area, and we have new studies led out by Sarah Jane Lee and Gerard Clark in our team, showing very clearly that the microbiome could be playing a role here in some of the negative effects of medications on brain health and cognition.
And I suppose something we must remember is that a lot of drugs are taken orally, and they're going into that big bioreactor that's within each one of us.
Absolutely.
And they may accentuate the drugs or may block it in some way.
Yeah, no, it's a really important area. But a lot of our work is also has been really influenced and informed and inspired by the work Felice has done, which over many years showing the negative impact of poor diet on mental health, and I think that's something you'd like to elaborate on.
Maybe you'll say something about that, Felice.
So I head up the Food and Mood Centre at Deakin University in Australia. So we are down near the coast in the southern part of Australia.
Beautiful part of the world.
Yes, and John has visited
I have visited
there. And I feel really lucky to get to hang out with John and with Ted and Jer and everyone, because the work that they do, primarily in the lab with animals and microscopes and things like that, complements what we do, which is looking very much at humans, both in the clinic and also epidemiology, which is sort of looking right across populations. And so the field of research that I lead is called Nutritional Psychiatry, and that focuses on how diet, our daily diets, influence our mental and brain health right across the life course. And from that, we know that the quality of our food is critically important, from what our mums ate while they were pregnant, right the way through to the end of life. And it's quite independent of things like socioeconomic status, education, income, but also body weight, nothing to do with body weight. But what we eat, of course, plays a really important role in our mental and brain health. And food being the fundamental petrol that drives every action in our body. But of course, over the last 10, 15 years, understanding that there's these microbes that are heavily influenced by diet, and that in turn heavily influence mental and brain health via all these pathways that we've known for a long time are very important, particularly the immune system, but aspects of our brain and brain plasticity, our neurotransmitter systems and the way our genes are turned on and off, these sorts of things. They're all really profoundly influenced by the microbes that live in our gut and probably in our mouth and other places as well, skin. And when we feed them the food that they need to thrive and to do what they do, and this is primarily plant fibres, so things that we get from fruit and vegetables and legumes, whole grains, very important. Those fibres and the phytochemicals that we get from plants, people know them as polyphenols or antioxidants, these are food for our microbes. Our microbes use that to then generate these thousands of molecules that do all that important work of influencing our health, our physical health, our mental and brain health. But of course, in our industrialised food system and environment, we are very rarely getting enough of the fibre and the polyphenols that the microbes need to be able to do their job. And of course, we're seeing now this real epidemic of diseases related to our immune system, things like, asthma and eczema and allergies, but also autoimmune conditions, celiac disease and rheumatoid arthritis and MS, things like this. But I think very importantly too is the understanding that the environment, the environmental microbes, the microbes that live in the soil, which is the largest source of biodiversity on the planet, and that then in the air, the water, and the microbes in us are thoroughly interrelated. So the industrialised food system destroys both of them. It reduces the biodiversity of our gut microbes. it reduces the biodiversity of the environmental microbes, and it all comes back to food. So this is why we look at this in great detail.
And what about like the negative aspects of food, as you say these diets, say keto diets, or also, but in the main, the Western diet, and where you have a lot of ultra-processed foods, say for instance, you have chemical preservatives in there, you have additives in there, you have a lot of simple sugars and things like that in there.
Salt.
Would you think that affects, you know, people's mental agility? And
so what we see, and I mean obviously it's complex, there's two aspects to diet really, and I think a lot of people think that one sort of balances out the other or counteracts the other, but actually what we see is that two aspects of diet are both independently related to mental health in the case of where we look most. So not having enough of the good stuff, so the foods that have got the fibre and the polyphenols and the really healthy fats like the extra virgin olive oil, things like that, and then too much of the bad stuff, which is the foods that have a lot of added fats and sugars and salts and things like this. The ultra-processed foods themselves, they may be particularly noxious because they have in particular emulsifiers, which we know do damage to the gut lining. They have artificial sugars, they have a lot of exposure to microplastics and phthalates and BPA and all of these things that come in the packaging and the processing of these foods, and we know that they do damage to the microbes. So there's a whole host of things related to the Western diet that's hugely problematic, but it's also the way we produce our food. I mean, not only are we not eating enough of the foods that our body and our microbes need, the way we're growing those foods is enormously problematic because we're using pesticides and fungicides and herbicides and artificial fertilizers. And all of these destroy the microbiome of the soil. Now that is like the beating heart of the planet. That's where our microbes are so critically intertwined with ours. So modern agricultural techniques are reducing the biodiversity not just of trees and insects and animals, but the microbes in the soil, and therefore the microbes within the vegetables and, for example, on them, inside them, and that is really, really problematic. And that's a really new area that I don't think people have really kind of twigged to yet, but this is where we're doing quite a bit of research now.
But a challenging area, though, right? There's so many factors at play.
Yeah.
How do we, deconvolute and also get at causal relationships here? I mean,
so look, it's really hard because if you think, we know that the brain, of course, is the most complex organ thing really that we know of in the universe, and diet is the most complex exposure that we're all exposed to several times a day. So there's not just your macro and micronutrients, your vitamins and minerals and fibre and protein and fat, but there's they now think there may be as many as 150,000 different phytochemicals in plants, ideally anyway, if they've been grown in microbially active soil. The way that you get at causality, I mean, it's obviously complex, as most things in science are, but you need to do randomised controlled trials.
Yes.
And so that's what we've focused on. Our seminal study, the SMILES trial, was the first to show that if you took people with moderate to severe major depressive disorder, and many of these people have been sick for a very long time, very, very impaired, most on other forms of treatment, antidepressants, what have you, and half of them received a befriending protocol, which is social support. The other half received support from a dietitian to increase the amount of that good food in the diet.
Like fibre and stuff.
Yeah, extra virgin olive oil, fruits, vegetables, legumes, fish, but very importantly also reduce the unhealthful foods. And we saw a major difference at the end of 12 weeks where a full third of the people who got the dietary support actually went on to have a complete remission of their depression. The recent study that we've just done, we're just about to submit, has looked at the dietary data in more detail. And what we see is that people got a real extra bang for their buck if they gave up ultra-processed foods. So they got an additional 2.5-point reduction in their symptoms of depression for every serve of ultra-processed foods that they gave up. So that seemed to be a really important driver of that effect.
Wow. And did you look at the actual microbiota and was it changed in
That's-
those?
I think that's
I wish.
that's the key part. But you would hypothesize based on all of the other
Yes.
data and also some of the basic science work that it is actually probably the microbiome that at least is playing a significant role in the positive effects of such a diet, because it makes
Yes.
sense.
I mean, and if you think about all of those factors in your body that are affected by diet, and that in turn affect our mental and brain health, so many of them involve the microbiome.
Yeah.
And the immune system, as I said, is really, really important. But there's so many aspects to it. The ultra-processed foods are really interesting, though, and getting back to your question about nutrition and how tricky it is to study these things. If you think about ultra-processed foods, they are, in general, ones that we know of as being unhealthy because they've got terrible nutritional profiles. They've got added sugar, they've got added salt, they've often got unhealthful forms of fat. They have, very, very little nutritional value. So that's a problem in itself. But then the ultra-processed foods have the additional problem of the emulsifiers, artificial sugars, these sorts of things. And so teasing apart whether it's actually the processing itself, or it's just that they have a really terrible nutritional profile is tricky. Now, one of the things we've just done recently, which I think is super interesting, because it's such a controversial area, and keeping in mind that 70 of the 100 top largest companies in the world produce ultra-processed foods. There's a lot of money here, and they really love to, insert themselves through different ways into the public conversation, and they say, nanny state, you don't want to be told what to eat and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of the conversation has been around whether it is just the terrible nutritional profile of the food or whether it's something about the processing. And one of the arguments for some people on one side of the argument is that if the ultra-processed food is nutritionally balanced, so if it has low sugar because it's got artificial sugars, it's got low added fat, it's got added protein, it's got added fibre, it's got added vitamins and minerals, and nutritionally it's balanced, well, that should be fine. That's a food then.
And you think that should be fine?
Well, this is what some people say. And then on the other side of it, the more public health focused researchers like myself, we're like, no, we've got then this thing, this frankenfood, which used to be food once and is no longer. It doesn't have things in a food matrix. It doesn't have things as nature intended. So what we did is we actually looked at this, and we took nearly 50 women who were living with obesity, and they often go on to these very low energy diets, and they're like meal replacements, shakes and bars. Now they are nutritionally balanced. They've got low sugar, low all the things. So they should be okay according to this argument. And then, so half of them got that. The other half got an equivalent calorie, very low calorie diet that was vegetables and legumes mainly. And at the end of 3 weeks, they both lost the same amount of weight, both groups. But the microbiome diversity, which is a sort of a marker of a healthy microbiome, went up in the women who got the real food, and it went down in the women who got the artificial,
I do think that's because of the nature of the processing, like when you process food, you might use a lot of heat, you might use a lot of pressure, you might change the proteins in there, denature them and so on.
We don't really know. There is a huge amount of research that still needs to be done, but it is a really interesting finding that suggests that our microbes don't receive or interpret ultra-processed food in the way they do real food. And then they're talking to the brain, and the brain is not getting the signals. And we know that when people have ultra-processed food, they tend to eat a hell of a lot more. And that
maybe
could be
affect
part of
intestinal transit too,
Could
maybe
do that.
Doesn't,
And the hippocampus as well. So hippocampus is that region of the brain, that one region that tends to be very plastic. And it is very important in learning and memory, very important in mental health, but it's also important in appetite regulation. And we know that even just a few days of unhealthy foods in young, healthy college students can impair the hippocampal related memory and cognition, so it basically, reduces your brain power, but also impair appetite regulation and make people more hungry. So it could be to do with the hippocampus as well. which of course is also influenced by the microbes.
Sure. Absolutely.
When I think of ultra-processed foods, because I come from a dairy background, I think of infant milk formula. And Ireland produces a lot of infant milk formula. And there's a lot of processing involved in it. But obviously there's a lot of, it's becoming more and more complex now as they're using more human milk oligosaccharides and so on. But do you have an opinion on, because it's obviously a key point in life, and I know you work a lot in it as well, in early life, and how nutrition might affect, say, neurodevelopment and so on.
I couldn't say anything about the milk formulas, but I think it's a really important point, obviously. But we certainly are doing a lot of research on the early life microbiome and mothers' diets during pregnancy, which we're seeing from many of our colleagues' studies. Mothers' diets during pregnancy are very clearly linked to child emotional health outcomes, but also neurocognitive outcomes, so neurodevelopment. So we know that mothers who have unhealthier but Western diets during their pregnancy, the children are more likely to have ADHD. It looks like the new data, and some of this isn't even published yet, but it's linked to higher incidence of autism spectrum disorders. Part of it seems to be working through the immune system. So a paper that some of our team have recently produced showed that women who had unhealthier diets during pregnancy, they also had higher markers of inflammation, which is a marker of immune system function.
I have to ask, do you think the microbiome is playing a role? Because some of our animal studies looking at high-fat diet during pregnancy, we show that the maternal microbiome changes, these chemicals they make, the metabolites, that these can actually cross the placenta and can actually change the brain of the developing fetus in a way. So but there's probably other non-microbiome dependent ways as well. But the microbiome
microbiome is key because we consistently see that mothers who have a less healthy diet, they have a less healthy microbiome profile. And then that is linked to worse emotional health and behavioural health in the infants. And it's increasingly linked to ADHD and autism spectrum, but also probably things like food allergy and all of those things that are related to the immune system, because the immune system and the microbes are just so closely linked. So basically saying we need to make sure that women have access to and support for a healthy diet during their pregnancy. We've done a number of years of work developing a program and an app, and now we have funding to test this at scale. We're looking at outcomes in more than 1,000 children, and we'll be able to actually look at the microbes in the mum, in the babies, and then look at the children's neurocognitive outcomes at 2 to see if we can see those links, but also to see if we can actually improve mums' diets using a very simple app that has nothing to do with body weight, which has been a major issue. It's been so stigmatising and problematic.
And the other area, which of course Paul is very familiar with himself, and is in relation to the around perinatal microbiome, because it's that first 1,000 days, it's pregnancy and the first 2 years that's been critical. And Paul, together with Catherine Stanton and APC Microbiome, have been leading out on a number of studies over many years for the infant met study, charting the trajectory of the microbiome in these critical windows, but also more recently in a large-scale mimic study where we're looking at the microbes that are missing in women that deliver via cesarean section compared to those born vaginally, because we know that microbiomes are different, and we're trying to, in our studies, trying to look at the mechanisms about how these missing microbes could lead to missing signals that could support optimal brain health in our animal studies. And it's quite provocative and interesting, and it gives a public health message in terms of that we do need to look after these microbes in early life. And then moving on from C-section, there's of course breastfeeding is really important for our microbiome. And you mentioned, Paul, already the human milk oligosaccharides, and by being able to supplement early in life with human milk oligosaccharides, we're able to at least replenish some of the effects that are missing in C-section, but also may play a good role to counteract some of the effects of maternal obesity and other things. So being able to intervene early, I guess, is really important.
It's really important.
that.
But what about antibiotics? So this is the thing. I mean, I had 2 cesareans, and when I had my children, they cut the cord before they delivered the antibiotics to the mum. And now they cut the cord after the mum's got the antibiotics. And I wonder if something as simple as that could make a difference, is switching that.
Yes.
But, you know, so many kids are exposed to antibiotics in that first 12 months of life. Has your research looked at that? Yeah,
we did a study there last year where we looked at babies who'd got, in the first 4 days of life, had got gentamicin and penicillin for first 4 days of life, and looked at those babies at 6 months and 12 months. And we were actually looking for resistance to just those antibiotics. But in fact what we found was we got multiple drug resistance in those babies, because what you do is you don't select out just the drug resistance itself. You select out the organism that has already a history of being exposed to antibiotics, you know, back in its lineage. And so we don't really know the effect of treating with antibiotics very early in life. But a lot of these exposures, you know, these happen at a critical time in our development and neurodevelopment. I see all these problems that are like, you know, asthma, atopic disease, people, you know, a lot of diseases of the immune system, and so.
And the puzzle for us is, so, and that's well described, the immune system changes, but could there be changes in gut-brain signaling? And that's kind of where we still need a lot more causal data, especially longitudinal data in humans, to really pinpoint that it is. But it is, all of our work in animal models would suggest that indeed that there could be potential for long-term effects on gut-brain signaling.
Especially if you're getting changes in gut permeabilization, and you're getting a lot of leakage of antigens out into the bloodstream systemically, and, you know, causing problems maybe for the liver and kidneys as well, and you know, that affecting them back the brain, because you have a lot of potentially toxic, you know, molecules going around. You know?
Absolutely. I think this is a really fascinating aspect of the whole conversation about ultra-processed foods and industrial foods is the packaging, the exposure. And I was reading up in preparation for this, and I was really fascinated because you've got so many aspects. You've got BPA, which is on the lining of tins. So you've got tin tomatoes, tin beans, things like this, that you would have in the past said, well, this is a really healthy, inexpensive way to access these. But actually, particularly when it's really acidic things like tomatoes, you're leaching BPA. You've got microplastics from all of the wrapping and the different steps of the processing. And with the microplastics, it looks like they may damage that critically important mucus layer, the lining of the gut, not just because they're physically, it's like they're abrasive, but also because they sit in there and they leach these plastic, you know, toxins in there. Then you've got all of these PFAS that come from like the wrappers and things.
The forever chemicals. Forever chemicals.
Yeah. And so all of these really nasty pollutants. And the irony is, of course, that actually it looks like it's the microbes in the gut that are your main detoxification organ. It's actually them that do the heavy lifting of getting these things out of your system. So it all comes back to the microbes and just keeping your gut healthy. And this is what I always say, it's so incredibly complicated. You know, the sums are so difficult. The complexity is mind-boggling. But what you need to do to have a healthy microbiome is relatively simple. Lots of different types of plant foods. You don't have to be a vegetarian, but avoiding the things we know that the microbes don't like lots of fatty meats and saturated fat, salt, added sugar, ultra-processed foods. But also, I think adding in some fermented foods is probably a really good idea.
So we're really big fans of fermented foods in relation to mental health, and work together with my colleague Paul Cotter at Teagasc. We're really trying to understand the mechanisms as to how certain fermented foods can actually have what we call neuromodulatory potential, and it's there. They're able to produce these chemicals that have the potential to affect brain and behaviour.
They're just remarkable.
And it's, you know, and it is really exciting that we're building. These are, you know, kind of ancestral foods.
Yes.
And in Ireland here, we don't have a really good culture in fermentation, in fermented foods outside of beer. Outside of beer. But it is increasing. But
Yes.
but you know, like other cultures, whether the Eastern
Yes.
Europeans or the German sauerkrauts or the Korean kimchis, we just, it's not, you know what I mean. Even the
Do you have buttermilk? Buttermilk in the soda bread. That's pretty good.
And the British have pickles and other things that but here we can do a lot more, and this is really a superfood for a microbiome targeted superfood. And we've done some studies, small studies in humans, where we've shown if you can ramp up fermented foods and fibers, and we put people through stressful situations in the lab, that they have a much lesser sense of that stress.
Yeah.
And so we're now, ongoing work is trying to figure out, is it the fermented foods, is it the fiber, or do you need both? And that's really exciting work to be able to see.
Because
and I think that's really important, because we need to give people, it's easy for us, it's easy for us to sit here today in advance of World Microbiome Day and tell people everything that's really bad about our food systems and everything, but we have to give people options and things that they can do. And what I really like about fermented foods is that it's an option that we can democratize, because it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, because people can ferment themselves and do it with produce that can be locally sourced and culturally sensitive, and I think and give it to people that maybe could use it much better themselves overall. But there's another thing I wanted to bring up, because you know, we talked about early life and we talked about different strategies, but unfortunately all of us are getting older. Yeah, and our brains in particular are getting older. So should we just talk a little bit about aging and the microbiome and what we know and what we don't know, and what we can do in that regard?
Well, one of the most exciting things in my early career was one of the reasons I got into looking at this, food in relation to mental health, was because of some of the research that people like you, I think, were doing around the hippocampus. So that key region of the brain that actually does grow and shrink in response to things that it's exposed to, and that can grow or shrink, and actually it shrinks generally as you get older, and then you start to lose your car keys and forget your kids' names and all the rest of it. And a lot of animal studies had shown in the early 2000s that when you manipulate diet in rodents, that you can either grow or shrink the hippocampus with resulting impacts on learning and memory. And so I'd been working with a big cohort study in Australia. We'd already shown that the quality of people's diets, independent of all these other factors we took into account, was linked to the likelihood of people developing depression for the first time as they get older, which is something that does happen. But realising that there were MRI data on about 250 of them. So we were able to look at the size of people's hippocampi in relation to the quality of their diet, taking into account all those other factors, including depression. And what we saw was a very clear and very strong gradient. So people who had healthier diets had significantly larger hippocampus. Now that's since been shown in 2 far larger studies. And so it seems pretty clear that the quality of our diets has an impact on this key important region of the brain. And that's, as I said earlier, some of the studies in young, healthy university students have shown the opposite. You give them junk food for a week and it seems to shrink the hippocampus. So food, if you want to protect your brain and your brain power, but then there's also all these other indirect things, like the microbes in your mouth and this emerging understanding that that's linked to dementia. Now that's kind of terrifying, because they can get in there through your olfactory bulb, but also the trigeminal nerve. And it looks like and you would know more about this than me, but the plaque that your brain produces, it's an antimicrobial thing, isn't it? It's almost like your brain is trying to get rid of the bugs that have set up shop in your brain cells.
I mean, some of the most exciting data right now emerging on the microbiome is in the area of Alzheimer's disease.
Yes.
And Alzheimer's disease is associated with plaques, as you talk about. And, you know, it's becoming clear that some of these amyloid proteins are sensitive to microbial signals, and studies have shown, for example, if animals that are sensitive to these plaques grow up germ-free without microbes, they don't develop the plaques.
Wow.
And so we're getting more and more interested in that. We've been interested in basic cognitive function as we age.
Yeah.
So work, again, really seminal work out of APC Microbiome Ireland here from Paul O'Toole and Marcus Clayton, and you were involved, Paul. A study called ElderMet showed that individuals who have quite, I would say, bland diets have a low diversity in their microbiome and poorer health outcomes, specifically in relation to frailty overall. And so one of the questions then is can you replace that? And what that study was really important with was saying that people who lived in the community environment with a diverse diet, like what you were talking about, Felice, had a much better health outcome. And we've been interested in, as neuroscientists, can we relate that into what's going on in the brain? And that's some of the studies we've been doing in our animals. And one of the most remarkable studies we did was when we took microbes from young animals and gave them to older animals, and we basically rejuvenated the entire brain, including the hippocampus. And so they
give me that young person food, please. So FMT.
Before Felice runs out of here to try and steal one of my students' poop, that's not what we're saying at all. But what we're really saying is that it provides causal mechanisms that you need to really mind your microbes to look after your mind, specifically as we age. And now with other diseases, age-associated diseases like Parkinson's disease, we're also seeing very important data, two-way communication, but also how microbes can lead to signals going from the gut to the brain, and the Parkinson's might actually start in the gut. A really important age-related disorder. So on that, so I think that's important. I think we're getting questions.
I think we need to remember to brush our teeth and floss.
Always good.
And it's actually those organisms that cause gingivitis was the organisms that are implicated for Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, and they also go down when you swallow. And this is why PPIs can be a bit of a problem, because they allow more bugs to get down there.
Okay, so the
vaginal seeding.
There was a question there about that we have in about vaginal seeding, and this has been quite an interesting experimental approach, controversial by many of the accreditation bodies, and some of the data has been shown that vaginal seeding works. However, more and more people are seeing that it's much more complex, and it's not just the vaginal microbiome, but also the fecal microbiome.
Also, fecal transplants from the mother in work done in Finland. Has shown that they've really showed them the exact same as full childbirth in C-section babies.
But in relation to gut-brain signaling, we know nothing, and very little in relation to gut-brain functioning on that.
I think what will happen though in this whole field is that when we find, like one of the studies we have a mimic that's headed up by Catherine, we've identified what the missing microbes.
Catherine Stanton,
we've identified the missing microbes that are absent in C-section, and we've isolated them, and so we'll have defined communities that that I think will be a lot safer to use.
A lot safer, because if you start swaddling newborns in their mouth with a fecal microbiome and a vaginal microbiome, you can be introducing all sorts of nasties. So that's important to understand.
We have a really excellent question in about the role of the microbiome gut-brain axis in the perimenopause and the relationship, because we know, like, anytime you have transitions, you can bet that the microbiome is playing a role in relation. And transitions across the lifespan are really often associated with changes in mental health and resilience. And perimenopause is one of those transitions. And it's really, really important area. It's an area here in APC that we're really excited about. Siobhan O'Mahony, my colleague, is leading out on this.
And really a potential startup in that area
called FemBiome, where they're really looking at how do we support women's mental health, often neglected and really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Insulin resistance and linked to the microbiome. I'm not an expert on the metabolism side of things. I know that the microbiome plays an important role in metabolism and glucose regulation, but I don't know about it a lot. Research on the effects of hyperglycemia on cognition and murine model any effects of this disease that could affect the microbiome and therefore cause effects on
Absolutely.
emotions, like hyperglycemia.
Yeah,
that's a tricky one to measure.
So it links. I mean, what we're hearing from the audience who are submitting the questions is, you know, about the intricacies between body-brain interactions, and that the microbiome is really important aspect of body-brain. And like, there's a lot more focus now, because in medicine we've traditionally tended to compartmentalize the body.
Yeah.
And so if you're interested in mental health, you focus on everything from the neck up.
Yeah.
But now we're beginning to realize that these signals that are very important for a process we call interoception, how we feel, you know, are really key. Yeah. And so anything that affects metabolism will affect our brain, and especially at these transitory points overall.
Yeah, we're all interconnected. Like, we're not just a brain sitting on a body. Every single organ and system is interrelated.
Yeah.
When you think of food, you know, I just had a question for you. When you think of food, one of the things that's quite often in fast food is glutamate. And glutamate, we know, is converted to GABA, which is, you know, a neuroactive compound. Like, is glutamate good for you, would you think? Or what sort of effects might it have on your gut axis?
Glutamate is not good. It's generally, I mean, it's an essential amino acid in relation to our overall health, but by most of it isn't going to get to the brain or do anything really. It may have some local effects on the enteric nervous system, and of
course it might cross the gut-brain axis.
The blood-brain barrier.
The blood-brain barrier. Oh yeah.
So we have another question about our, and this is something I always have to be very careful about, and I feel sensitive about. Is about when we talk about early life and the microbiome, we can very quickly. It can sound like we can quickly get to mom blaming.
Oh God, yes.
And so as a mom, I really want to. But we have a question here about dads, and what about the dad microbiome? And if I had asked this question a year ago, I said, "Oh God, there's really little evidence there." Yeah. But really exciting work that has come out of the EMBL group in Rome, led up by Jamie Hackett last year, was published in Nature, showing the importance of the paternal microbiome in shaping health outcomes in the offspring.
Really?
In animal models, but it's really an epigenetic factor, and they show that by giving antibiotics to dads pre-conception and during the early mating period, that it was going to have long-term effects on overall health of the offspring.
Well, look,
and they looked at the mechanism.
So important. The epigenetics is so critical, and I know from the human point of view, the very large Norwegian cohort studies, and in this case the mother and baby cohort study, had over 100,000 parents and children that are being followed, and they saw that in over 100,000 men, there was a dose-response relationship between the men's metabolic health, like the size of their body, their obesity, and the risk of autism spectrum disorder, even when controlling for all of these things. And the speculation is, yes, it's happening via epigenetics, and of course the microbes affect epigenetics.
Well, microbes are very good epigenetic vehicles, if you want, in terms of what's going on. The other thing that I think is really important that we should mention in relation to mental health and brain gut is the whole area of circadian rhythms and sleep and the microbiome. Because one of the things, if you can get good sleep, then one of the problems we see associated with poor mental health outcomes is poor sleep, and the whole sleep field is now beginning to wake up to how the importance of the microbiome, and we may be able to generate certain psychobiotics that might have beneficial effects there. And then work that we published early in the year showed that there's a real intricate relationship between the oscillations of our stress hormones and our microbes, because your microbes change across the day. I mean, people don't really know that. And it may not just be what you feed your microbes, but when you feed your microbes. And we were able to show that was really important for how we mount a stress response. Now, and so that's going to be really important, because we know in certain disorders like bipolar illness, it's very much associated with circadian dysfunction, but many aspects of depression,
so what
ADHD.
About intermittent fasting? What do you think about that?
I think that it's having beneficial effects in some individuals because of its ability to shape the microbiome and change. And there's some really good studies on time-restricted eating, both in animals and in humans. and in fasting like Ramadan and other fasting circumstances overall on that. So I think that's important. We have a question about
the role of the microbiome in musculoskeletal disease. This is something that people in our lab are looking at, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I don't think we've gone very far in it.
There's like in things like fibromyalgia and disorders like that. I'm not sure if that's what they're thinking of, but there is growing evidence there for sure.
I think more like osteoporosis, bone turnover. It would be linked. I'd say almost certainly, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
And in relation to, we have a question then about irritable bowel syndrome and a very distinctly different gut disease, which is inflammatory bowel disease. Here the evidence is really strong.
Oh, very, very
strong. And so what we don't know, which I'm interested in, is what about the brain effects in these disorders? Because IBS is very much a disorder of the brain-gut communication, and it's very much laboured like that. And now there are products that help some individuals very much that target the microbiome. With inflammatory bowel diseases, we know that stress is one of the key flare-ups, and we know that the microbiome is shaping how we navigate stress. So again, you know, that's an exciting area, but we need to link these two together overall.
And particularly in IBD, like sufferers have a real unusual microbiota, you know, and it really changes their microbiota. Whether there's a causal effect on the disease or not is open to debate. There's been a lot of, I suppose, controversy about it as to what organism might be the initial insult that would have caused an over-inflammatory response. You know?
And causality is an important one. Can I just jump back to one of the previous questions, because I think it's a critically important aspect of the research that we do, and so many parts of the discussion around food and the food system is this idea of individual responsibility.
Yeah, I know. Difference is different.
It does my head in, because you know me. I'm interested in the science and mechanisms, how things work. But my background is very much public health. Like, I'm thinking big picture, and knowing that the industrial food system globally costs the planet roughly $20 trillion a year, and that's just with the basic information we have. There's lots of things we couldn't consider. More than half of that is the cost to human health, because unhealthy industrialised foods, through their impact on chronic disease, are the leading causes now of illness and early death. It's the leading cause of biodiversity loss because of the way we're farming and producing foods. But the way that these foods are developed, they are designed to interact with all those reward systems in the brain. They're very cheap. They're very heavily marketed. They're ubiquitous. You cannot walk down the street. You can't put petrol in your car. You can't take your kids to a swimming lesson without being bombarded with opportunities to consume these foods that really we just are designed to want. That's how we are designed as evolutionary beings. So this idea that it's down to personal responsibility, that if you're unwell or your child's unwell, it's your fault because you ate the wrong thing, it's so hugely problematic. People need to live in an environment that supports healthy food choices, and that comes down to food policy, and that is not the individual, that is all of us together saying, no, we've had enough.
And how can we as scientists and researchers, what can we do more to influence policy? And do you see any countries where the policies are ahead of the game in relation to it? Because I think that's what we need to get to. And the second part of my question then is about human behaviour. We all know, I can give you a list of all the stuff that's really good for us and good for our microbiome, but in our behaviour we will make choices influenced by what's going on, but how do we shift that?
It's because we're not robots, John.
We're not robots.
And our brains are very, very, very powerful, and those reward systems that drive us to want to drink and gamble and shop on the internet and eat donuts and all of those things. They are
is that a vicious circle, or that you get depressed and then you eat more, and then
well, like my microbes love carbohydrates. They just love really good sourdough. Like wonderful breads, and I just know that I just have to look at it and I gain weight. It's like absolutely.
But it doesn't stop me, does it? We have views on stool testing for microbiome and IBS management. I don't think we're there yet. What do you think?
I'm not there yet.
We're not there yet.
I really don't.
Fermented fibres shaping
gut microbiota, metabolism, gas production, and shaping brain
development.
I don't think we're there yet either.
Well, there's some good animal studies about fibre in early life, and in particularly if you deprive animals of fibres in early life, that it affects brain development.
Yes.
And some really interesting work out of Africa, preliminary work from Jeff Gordon's group and others showing that lack of certain both oligosaccharides and also prebiotics in particular, that might lead to stunted growth and brain development changes.
We looked at the microbiome of infants at 1, and then we looked at their emotional behavioural health at 2, and what we saw was that the kids who at 2 had much better behavioural emotional health. They were much more likely to have this particular bacteria, Prevotella cocci, at 1, and that's linked to fibre intake. These are kids who obviously, whatever they're eating at home, it's got fibre. Potentially they've got it from their mum. We don't know, but there's certainly, it's really important to have fibre. We know also from the animal studies that after 3 generations of having a low fibre diet, which is a standard American diet, standard Australian diet, that there's so many really important species that are lost or diminished to the point where they cannot be rescued, if you like, or brought back by just introducing fibre again. In fact, that can often cause, problems. But rather they needed to be an FMT, which is a poo transplant. Now the FMT stuff is super interesting.
Tell us about FMTs, please. I know you're like,
busting
and before we finish up, we should hear a little bit about where you think FMT is right now, and isn't there better ways to target the microbiome or not?
And I think that's part of the question, really, because when you're talking about an FMT from someone who's supposedly really healthy and has been very, very heavily screened, that's a whole microbiome sort of reset. Now, we ran the first randomised controlled pilot study to show that it was highly feasible. We took people who were very, very badly depressed. They came and had 4 days in a row of enemas, and every single one of them said that they would do it again. Every single one of them said it was acceptable. So we know it's feasible. What we've been doing is trying to get funding for a proper scaled randomised controlled trial. And one of the reasons for that is that we work with lived experience, people in the community who have a lived experience of mental illness.
Often recurrent
yes, and who really work with us to do research. And this is such an important and positive shift in mental health research. But one of them, who I've become quite good mates with actually, she wrote to me this morning because she saw that I was staying with you.
Oh, very good.
And she said, please tell John and his team that they saved my life. Now, this is probably not very scientific, but Jane is the most extraordinary woman whose story has been profiled a lot in the media in Australia. She's a subject of Australian Story. She lived with extremely severe bipolar disorder for 16 years, in and out of psychiatric hospital, multiple occurrences of psychosis, etc. 16 years completely just so incredibly unwell. She really didn't want to continue with this life. And her husband, Alex, is an ecologist, and he was looking to try and think, what can I do? He read the Transferring the Blues paper about FMT, and he thought, well, this makes sense. I understand the ecological principles of diversity and biodiversity. So they set out and they did a series of poo transplants from Alex's poo, which, don't do this at home. It can be super, super problematic.
Yes.
But she recovered. That was 7 years ago now, and she continues to remain well. And she said that a lot of people who've contacted her from around the world have got similar stories. Now, we need to show this in a proper randomised controlled trial. And we also work with Lifeblood, which is the national stool bank in Australia. It's also the national blood bank.
Sure.
And they recruit and screen people and have a whole bank of healthy stool that we want to be able to use to actually test whether this might work.
Okay.
Do you think it could go the opposite direction?
Yeah, well, you've got to be really...
Be careful who your donor is.
Yeah, that's right.
Or the donor mightn't suit you.
Yeah.
It might be that the donor's depressed.
Yeah.
There was a question that came in on the chat as well, which is linked to this, which is about, and it's quite a bigger question, but could we use our knowledge of microbiome gut-brain axis for potential for suicide prevention?
Yeah, wow.
Because that's what you're talking about on an N of 1 scenario there.
Yeah.
Where, and while we're not advocating FMTs, widespread FMT, but what we're saying is that from a public health concern, that if we can actually mine microbes better, and that we should be able to create a better resilience for stress, a better circadian rhythm, and hopefully a better way of cognitive function to make decision making, that by really feeding our microbes might be, but we need, of course, data, but might be,
This is the thing, we need
might be
research.
a way of doing this.
And we've applied for 4 years in a row with such great data to support it, and we still cannot get funding for it. And this is a problem when you can't get funding for research.
And it is
so important.
and it is something that we've also faced here in Ireland, although we've been very generously funded by the Irish government for 22 years.
Yeah.
But for this more, what I would say, high risk work, I've had to rely on very generous private philanthropy donors,
Yes.
and that's been really instrumental.
That's how we funded the pilot study.
in helping, and we now have done that numerous times, and that's really important to help us get the base round work that will then be fueled into competitive funding grants.
That's right.
And overall, and it's a really good way of working private and public systems working together overall. But we do need a lot more funding overall.
Can microbiome be used in as a therapeutic in treating autoimmune diseases?
None of us are really rheumatologists, but there is a lot of really exciting work in autoimmunity, whether it's in multiple sclerosis or, as we mentioned, in relation to inflammatory bowel diseases and various things. So we are.
Are we moving to nutritional psychiatry? Are we?
Yeah, well, we certainly, in Australia, our Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatry now has what is essentially lifestyle medicine. They call it the foundation of treatment for mood disorders. So, but of course, most psychiatrists and other practitioners get very little training in nutrition. So we've designed through our Food and Mood Academy accredited training that's endorsed by the RNCP, so that they can understand what the evidence is, what it isn't, but also how to sort of put that into clinical practice. The Canadian guidelines now, they have lifestyle as the third pillar. Before I came here, I went with Teagasc, who's the director of the Food and Mood Academy. She's wonderful.
She's a superstar.
Oh, she's a superstar. What she's done almost single-handedly with hardly any funding, because we're just relying on philanthropy, she's developed like the free online course. Can everybody out there, if you're interested in
free online
course in nutritional psychiatry, it is to date enrolled more than 90,000 people from around the world.
I mean, that's impact. That's impact. Yeah.
But now we've got this for psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. But the APA, the big American Psychiatric Association, has chosen lifestyle as their theme now. The World Psychiatric Association. So finally the data are there now. And of course we produced this huge 3 years worth of work from an international task force, the first set of clinical guidelines for the application of lifestyle-based care and depression treatment. So people who, if they're health practitioners, they can access that. So yes, I think the future is at least lifestyle psychiatry.
Yes.
So I think we've got like 2 minutes, 2 minutes left, and what I hope we've got through today is that we're on this journey, and we're trying to understand, the relationship between the microbes and the gut-brain axis, and what we're seeing is how basic science is now moving into clinical practice and into policy even, potentially. We have a long way to go, but it's been a really exciting journey for me, and I get to meet really cool people from all over the world who and here in Ireland, it's one of the areas that we at APC Microbiome Ireland have really invested heavily in and supported, and we feel that we can actually make real impactful research that's going to change everyone's lives, and we don't have all the answers, and that's we have a long way to go yet, but it's been very exciting, and under Paul's leadership it's been really important that we can actually over the next 10 years hopefully really see some of what this basic science is translate into patient-focused work. Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I personally am super excited about bringing together the human health, the planetary health, because they're one and the same. And it's all through the microbes, and we've got to look after those microbes. So eat your vegetables, eat your beans, and brush your teeth.
So what an area, and what a fantastic, thanks very much Felice, and thanks John, two champions of the gut-brain axis. So
And
Thanks,
aren't we lucky
Felice,
to work together?
We were very lucky to work
and
together.
thanks for those fantastic questions.
Thanks, everyone. Happy World Microbiome Day.
Yeah, happy World Microbiome Day.